The air inside the courtroom was thick with judgment. Everyone in the gallery had already made up their minds. The defendant, Luke Callahan, a decorated war veteran who had served 2 tours overseas, was sitting at the defense table in his worn-out suit, his cane resting against the chair. His once strong frame had withered since his service, a result of the injuries he had sustained. But his spirit? That was still unbroken. Across from him, the prosecutor, a young, overconfident man named Ethan Reynolds, adjusted his tie and turned toward the jury. His voice was dripping with mock sympathy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reynolds began, walking to the center of the courtroom, "we all respect Mr. Callahan's service to our country." He gestured toward Luke without looking at him. "But today, we are not here to discuss his past. We are here to discuss his crimes." Luke's fingers tightened around the table's edge, but he said nothing. He had been through worse than this. Reynolds paced in front of the jury, his voice smooth and calculated. "The state will prove beyond any doubt that Luke Callahan knowingly and deliberately stole from his employer $150,000 in military pension funds, a crime that is both shameful and indefensible." The gallery murmured in disapproval. A veteran stealing from other veterans? It was enough to turn sympathy into disgust. Reynolds turned toward Luke. "Mr. Callahan, would you care to explain how your bank account received 3 separate wire transfers from the stolen funds?" Luke lifted his eyes to the prosecutor, calm, unreadable. The judge, Honorable Regina Whitmore, studied Luke as well. She had seen many criminals in her years on the bench, but Luke didn't fit the mold. Still, evidence was evidence. Luke finally spoke, his voice steady. "I didn't steal that money." Reynolds smirked. "Then maybe you can tell us who did." Luke exhaled slowly, then reached for his cane, gripping it tightly as he stood up. His next words changed everything. "I can tell you exactly who did it." He paused, then looked the prosecutor straight in the eye. "And I have the evidence to prove it." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. A hush fell over the courtroom. Luke Callahan stood tall, despite the cane supporting his weight. His words had landed like a hammer on glass, fracturing the narrative that had been built against him. Across the room, Prosecutor Ethan Reynolds scoffed, crossing his arms. "Evidence?" he repeated, voice laced with mockery. "Mr. Callahan, if you had evidence proving your innocence, why are we just hearing about it now?" Luke let a small smirk tug at the corner of his lips. "Because until today, I didn't think I'd need to use it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed military envelope. Judge Whitmore's expression sharpened. "Mr. Callahan, what is that?" Luke walked forward, handing it to the bailiff. "This, Your Honor, is a classified document from the Department of Defense. It contains information about a military contractor, one with direct access to the pension fund I was accused of stealing from." Murmurs exploded through the courtroom. Judge Whitmore took the envelope, inspecting the official markings. "Where did you get this?" Luke's voice remained calm. "From a source who doesn't want his name involved, but I can assure you, Your Honor, once you read it, you'll understand exactly what's going on." Reynolds's smirk faltered. The judge broke the seal and pulled out the contents. A long silence followed as she scanned the document. Then, her brows furrowed. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Luke watched as the shift happened. The doubt in her eyes was replaced by something else. Understanding. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, I must object." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. Her voice, once neutral, now carried a sharp edge. "Mr. Reynolds, did the prosecution have access to these financial reports?" Reynolds blinked. These aren't official evidence." Judge Whitmore narrowed her eyes. "That's not what I asked." Luke's voice cut through the room. "Tell me, Mr. Reynolds, did your office deliberately ignore these documents because they pointed to someone more powerful?" Silence. Reynolds's jaw tightened, and everyone in the room knew the case had just changed. The weight of Judge Whitmore's stare pressed down on Prosecutor Ethan Reynolds. For the first time since the trial began, he looked visibly uncomfortable. Luke Callahan, still standing tall with his cane, watched him closely. He could see the wheels turning in the prosecutor's head. Reynolds knew what that document meant. And now, so did the judge. Judge Whitmore set the document down and folded her hands. Mr. Reynolds, this classified report details unauthorized financial movements made by a subcontractor working with the Department of Defense. These movements directly correlate with the missing pension funds. Her gaze sharpened. Are you telling me the prosecution was unaware of these details? Reynolds hesitated. Your Honor, this is unexpected. Luke chuckled. Not unexpected. Inconvenient. Reynolds shot him a glare, but it lacked the confidence he had at the start of the trial. Luke leaned on his cane. That document doesn't just prove my innocence. It proves who actually stole the money. Judge Whitmore lifted the report again, flipping through its pages. According to this, a private military contractor, Sentinel Defense Solutions, was responsible for handling these funds. And yet, nowhere in the prosecution's case did I hear Sentinel Defense mentioned. She turned to Reynolds. Why is that? Reynolds shifted, searching for an answer. Your Honor, we followed the evidence available to us. Luke didn't let him continue. No, you followed the evidence that fit your case. A few audible gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reynolds gritted his teeth. Mr. Callahan, if you had access to this document, why didn't you turn it over earlier? Luke smirked. Because I knew exactly what you'd do with it. He gestured toward the judge. You'd ignore it, just like you ignored it before. The difference now? The whole courtroom just saw it. Reynolds's face flushed red. Judge Whitmore let out a slow breath, then turned to the jury. Given this new evidence, I will allow a full review before proceeding further. She looked at Reynolds. But I will warn you, Mr. Reynolds, if this document was knowingly withheld, there will be serious consequences. Luke Callahan sat down. For the first time since this trial began, the scales of justice were tipping in his favor, and everyone knew it. The courtroom was no longer just a battleground for justice. It was a crime scene, not because of Luke Callahan, but because of the people who had put him here. Judge Whitmore's fingers drummed lightly on the bench as she turned back to Prosecutor Ethan Reynolds. I will ask one more time, she said, voice razor sharp. Did the prosecution deliberately omit this document from the case? Reynolds hesitated for half a second too long. The silence was damning. Luke Callahan's voice cut through the tension. I can answer that, Your Honor. He tapped the document in front of him. Not only did they ignore this evidence, but the real thief was never even investigated. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. Go on. Luke adjusted his stance, gripping his cane as he spoke. That document links the stolen pension funds to Sentinel Defense Solutions, a military contractor with high-level government connections. He turned toward the jury. They laundered money through veteran pension accounts, then moved it offshore. He locked eyes with Reynolds. And yet I was the one sitting in this chair. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Reynolds looked cornered. Objection, Your Honor, he finally snapped. This is all theory. Mr. Callahan has no proof that Sentinel Defense actually stole the money? Luke smirked. That's where you're wrong. He turned back to the bailiff. Can you pull up Exhibit 5A? The courtroom monitor flickered to life. A bank statement appeared on screen, dated 1 week before the stolen funds vanished. Luke pointed at a name buried in the fine print. Gregory Hawthorne, CEO of Sentinel Defense Solutions. The same man who had testified against him. Judge Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. Reynolds went pale. Luke spoke again, his voice calm, yet lethal. Mr. Hawthorne sat in this very courtroom and told everyone I was the one who diverted those funds. But according to these financial records, Sentinel Defense transferred nearly the exact amount of missing money into a shell account. He exhaled. So I ask you, Your Honor, why am I the one on trial? The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Whitmore's gaze darkened as she turned toward the prosecution. And at that moment, everyone knew who the real criminal was. The courtroom had never been this silent. Every eye in the room was locked onto the screen, where the evidence against Gregory Hawthorne, the CEO of Sentinel Defense Solutions, was now undeniable. Luke Callahan sat back in his chair, his expression calm. He had seen battles before, and this was no different. Except this time, his weapon was the truth. Judge Whitmore set down the document, exhaling slowly. She turned toward Prosecutor Ethan Reynolds, her patience wearing dangerously thin. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, "did the prosecution verify Mr. Hawthorne's financial records before using his testimony?" Reynolds's throat bobbed. He had no way out. We were led to believe Mr. Callahan was the primary suspect," he stammered. Luke tilted his head. "Who led you to believe that?" Reynolds clenched his jaw. Isolated, exposed, and completely out of options. Luke tapped his fingers against the table. "Let me guess, you didn't discover this case, it was handed to you." Reynolds stayed quiet. Judge Whitmore's gaze hardened. "Answer the question, Mr. Reynolds." A long pause. Then, finally, in the weakest voice the courtroom had ever heard from him, Reynolds muttered, "Mr. Hawthorne." The gallery exploded in whispers. Luke nodded. "So, let me get this straight." His voice carried the strength of a man who had been pushed too far. "A known defense contractor who had access to the same funds I supposedly stole was the one who pointed the finger at me." He leaned forward. "And you just took his word for it." Reynolds had nothing left to say. The judge turned to the bailiff. "Issue a subpoena for Mr. Gregory Hawthorne immediately. I want him in this courtroom by morning." Then she turned back to Reynolds. "As for the prosecution, we will be reviewing this case thoroughly." Luke exhaled slowly. For the first time since the trial started, he felt something that had eluded him for months. Relief. Because now, the real fight was about to begin. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. The weight of the truth had crushed the prosecution's case, leaving nothing but a trail of mistakes, corruption, and misplaced trust. Judge Regina Whitmore leaned back in her chair, her fingers pressed together in deep thought. Then, she made her decision. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented today, it is clear that the case against you was built on false pretenses." Luke gripped his cane tightly. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Whitmore turned to the jury. "Given these revelations, I am issuing an immediate dismissal of all charges against Mr. Callahan, effective immediately." A beat of silence. Then, the gallery erupted. The press jumped to their feet, cameras flashing, scrambling to report the turn of events. Spectators whispered, shaking their heads, some clapping. But at the prosecution's table, Ethan Reynolds sat stiff as a board, staring at the desk in front of him. He had lost, and he knew what was coming next. Judge Whitmore's eyes locked onto Reynolds. "This court does not take kindly to manipulated prosecutions. I am ordering a full investigation into how this case was built and why critical evidence was ignored." Reynolds said nothing, because what could he say? Then, she delivered the real blow. "As for Mr. Gregory Hawthorne, a warrant will be issued for his immediate arrest. He will stand trial for financial fraud, conspiracy, and perjury." Luke exhaled sharply. He had waited months for this moment, and now justice was finally catching up to the right man. As the courtroom emptied, reporters rushed toward Luke. "How does it feel to be free, Mr. Callahan? What's your next move?" Luke smiled faintly, adjusting his cane. "I'm going home." And with that, the veteran who had been wrongly accused walked out of the courthouse. No longer a defendant, but a man who had proven the truth.